This conference will now be recorded.
So just recapping on our previous class, looking at John chapter 1. And so this idea of the word here, the word logos, is this idea of wisdom, which was with God at the very beginning. And so when God created the heavens and the earth and established our creation, he did it with an objective, and wisdom was with him. He had a plan in mind. It wasn't just a random set of activities that were undertaken. And we looked at this chapter 1 here, and we found that there were a number of different days highlighted. So do you recall what the days were? What was the first day was a day of creation. So on day one. What was day one?
Light.
The day was light, yep. And that correlates, doesn't it, nicely? The Logos was the light. It was the light of men. It was the light of men. What was day 2? Now, Master. The heavens and the earth, separation of the heavens and the earth. And we saw that, didn't we, in the separation of the waters where Christ was baptized. Separated, the Christ was baptized. And Christ came out of the water. And what came down? The dove, didn't it? The dove came down. So we've got waters of baptism. And you've got the dove from heaven. So that idea of separation of the heavens. And then day 3 was day 3.
What is from land?
Yes, land. So what is the land? What is land literally? It's the foundation upon which we walk, isn't it? And what did Christ say to Peter? On this rock. Right. Day 4, we had the sun, moon, and stars, didn't we? And we had that conversation between Christ, who was the King of Israel, Christ the King, and Nathaniel. What was Nathaniel thinking about?
Jacob's ladder.
Jacob's ladder, that's right. And what does Christ say to Nathaniel? An Israelite indeed, and in whom is no Jacob, right? And so he's saying, he's identifying Nathaniel as of the stars, isn't he? Because what was the promise to Jacob? Your people will be like the... No, doesn't he? He says sand. Sand. Or what did he say to Abraham? He says your people will be like the sand and the stars. Right? And he confirms that promise. And so we've got this identification. And then we missed 2 days, day 5 and day 6 we missed, and then day 7 is what? It's the marriage supper, isn't it? The marriage. And so what we're introduced to here is this creative process. It is a spiritual creation. And the purpose of John's book, which is a bit different to the other Gospels and the way it's structured, is actually a story about the development of the sons of God. And how does it start? It starts out with one man, word made flesh. How does John end? Yeah, so what do they represent?
Everyone coming together.
Many made word.
And on.
Yeah. So we want to look at that because chapter 1 and chapter 21. Chapter 21 is the culmination of chapter 1 of John. Right? And so this idea that wisdom is a creative process. God at the beginning had the Logos, and that was a creative process. What was the process that God was creating? The whole purpose of creation was to create the Son of God. Well, actually the sons of God. And so when we come to John 21, we find that is really spelled out to us in an interesting little parable. the Word made flesh. We had the rock, we had the stars, sand, and we looked at where Benjamin was. So we're going to come to John chapter 21. So John chapter 21, Christ has been crucified, and Peter, being the practical individual that he is, says, well, I'm not going to sit around here feeling sorry for myself. I'm going to go fishing. And so he goes out fishing. Okay. People. How many people go with John, with Peter fishing? You're reading carefully there? How many was it? Right. 7. It's actually not told to us as 7. It's actually 5 plus 2 others. Right. So 5 are named. That's important. Right. 5 are named, and then 2 others. Right. Now, we spoke about this last time. What is 2 in John often associated with? Division? Separation? Yeah. Well, there was 1, 2, 3, 4 days, and then 2 missing days, and then there was the 7th day, right? So 2 days are missing, and then we find those 2 days are picked up where? With the Samaritans, right? So all the way through, this comes up a few times in John, but 2 is associated with Gentiles in John. Right? We find it crops up every so often where it's and 2. For example, he goes to Bethany. Lazarus dies, and Christ. Lazarus is very sick, and they send somebody to go and find Jesus. And where's Jesus? Remember where he is? Yeah, Bethabara. The name Bethabara, which is well north. Like if we go back to this map here, like Bethabara is way up, way up past Saffron, right? Like way up. By the way, Bethabara has another name. Do you want to have a guess at what it is? Bethabara's other name is Bethany of the Gentiles. Interesting, isn't it? Because here's Bethany with Lazarus, who's dying, right next door to Jerusalem. There's death there. They send for Jesus Christ, and where's he? Well, he's way up near the Gadarenes, right? This is where Bethabara is, right? And it's called Bethany of the Gentiles. And you got a comparison. You've got right. So where's the Lord of life? He's with the Gentiles. Where is death? It's with the Jews. But then Jesus delays 2 days. He waits 2 days. He waits 2 days for the Gentiles. He delays to come back. Anyway, that's an aside. So we've got these 7, and they go fishing. Now, what's the difference between this fishing trip and the last fishing trip that's recorded? If you come back to Luke chapter 5, Luke chapter 5, because there is a comparison. You really do need to read Luke 5 and Luke 21 together. Yes, their nets break. So they are not yet prepared for the work of catching men. But there's something else about this. I think it's in this record about the fish. And I think it's to do with the word multitude. They catch a multitude of fish, but the fish were of varying sizes. I think there might not be this. It might be another record. It might be Mark, but it talks about the fish were of different sizes. Right? There were big fish and small fish and all sorts of different types of fish. And there was a multitude of fish. Whereas when we get to John chapter 21, what are the fish? What kind of fish do they catch? Great fish, right? So these fish are big fish. So like Luke 5 is a multitude, and it's a mixed bag. Right? Whereas we get to John 21, and it's a multitude, and it's great fish. And over here, the net breaks. But yeah, net does not break. Okay? So there's quite a big difference between those two miracles. So here's the beginning of the ministry, and here's the end of the ministry. So at this point in time, the disciples aren't prepared. They're not educated enough. They're not mature enough to actually do the job of fishing men. But at this point in time, they are. Right? The development process has occurred. They've been through that process. Now, it says that it was a multitude of fish. How many fish was it? 153. We're not told how many over here. It's just a multitude, just a lot. They lost nothing. Yeah, and they lost a bunch of them. Yep. So a bunch of them didn't make it. Checking my notes here. And so they managed to get in, and Peter jumps in the water and swims. And what is happening? What is happening with Christ? What's Christ doing? Well, he's got a fish. It's a singular fish. That's the Greek is singular, and he's cooking it. It's interesting, actually, that the word fish here that's used of Jesus' fish is the same Greek word that's used of the two little fish that the boy had for the feeding of the 5,000. Remember that? He had, 5 loaves and 2 small fish? It's actually, the Greek doesn't imply small at all. The Greek word actually means prepared or completed. It means seasoned, ready for eating. Right? That's what the Greek word means. And so those 5 loaves and 2 fish were probably the disciples' lunch. Christ and the disciples' lunch. They had enough food. And if it was 2 little small kippers, then that's not going to go around 12, 13 men very well. So it wasn't small in stature. What it meant was prepared. And so Christ's fish here, it is a prepared fish. It's a ready fish. It's a completed fish. Right? So number of fish, right? Number of fish there, number of fish, and you've got Christ's fish. And it is prepared. Now, do you want to guess what the word for fish is for the fish that the disciples bring in? Trevally? Snappers? No, I went trevally or snapper. I have a guess at what the Greek word. If Christ's fish, right, which is cooking on the coals, is prepared fish, what word for fish do you think these ones are? Huh? Just a raw fish. Actually, it's not. It's the same word. Same word, which is kind of odd, I think, wouldn't it? Because I've just pulled these fish out. Now they're even gutted. They're not scaled. They're not, not cooked at all. Not prepared or seasoned. But these fish and this fish are considered the same. Now that gives you a clue, because what does this number mean? Because there's lots of brothers and sisters who have bent their brains about trying to look at 103 means. You want to know what it means? Nothing. It means absolutely nothing. It means absolutely nothing. And it means nothing for a good reason. It means nothing unless you add Christ's fish. So if we add Christ's fish, how many fish have you got? How many disciples were there?
Oh, that's both sides.
22. Why is 22 important? What's important about 22? Well, remember the Word made flesh, right? At the very beginning, chapter 1, Christ was the Word made flesh, wasn't he? So what is the Word of God made up of? It's made up of letters, isn't it? Because how do you create words? You create words by letters. So give you a clue. 22 is the number of... Right. The alphabet. So now what we're being told is, we started out in Genesis and John chapter 1, where you had the Word made flesh as one individual, and you get to the end of the book, and it's like, now we've got many, many, many people made. These fish represent the ecclesia, and now they are made the Word of God. Then might go, Justin, that's probably a long way to draw. Fair enough. It would be, but we've got a great quote in Zephaniah chapter 3. Come across to Zephaniah chapter 3.
I'm lost. How does 154 with 722?
Because if you divide 154 by 7, you get 22. Sorry. Come across to Zephaniah chapter 3. And it's one of those books which is sort of hidden amongst a whole bunch of other little books. After Hosea, after Joel, after Amos, Obadiah, Micah, Habakkuk, Zephaniah. Okay. Zephaniah chapter 3. And verse 8 to 9. Therefore, wait ye upon me, saith Yahweh, until the day that I rise up to the prey, for my determination is to gather the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms, to pour upon them mine indignation, even my fierce anger, for all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. So what's he talking about? Well, he's talking about the future judgment of the nations, isn't he? He's talking about the precursor to the establishment of God's kingdom. And he goes on and he says, for then will I turn to the people a pure language, that they might call upon the name of Yahweh to serve him with one consent. Now here's the challenge, right? You want to call upon Yahweh. How do you call upon Yahweh? Well, you've got to use a pure language, don't you? That's the point he's saying here. I'm going to give them a pure language, right? So they can call upon me, which would imply then that if they didn't have a pure language, they can't call upon him. Now, what does it matter that they have a pure language or not? Well, it's not that they speak a particular language, it's that that language has an impact upon them, isn't it? Because what does God say about prayer? Does God hear the prayers of the wicked? No, it doesn't matter what language they use. They can use Swahili, English, German, French, Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, Greek, it doesn't matter. It's the impact of the language upon them. Now, you know what's interesting about verse 8 of Zephaniah chapter 3? Every letter of the Hebrew language is used in that verse. So what's the pure language? It has to be Hebrew, right? So that's why this is important. It's the pure language, if it affects your heart. So when we get to John chapter 21, you've had this whole developmental process of the ecclesia, the development of the ecclesia, and you get to here, and then Christ is saying, work complete. It's a parable about the completion of the work of Christ with the saints, that they might themselves become the Word of God. So in Genesis chapter, in John 1, the creationary process is, it starts with the Word made flesh, and at the end of John, it's, well, here is a multitude of people who are now the Word of God. It represents it. But you only get there if Christ's involved. If you miss that out, this doesn't mean a thing. That's the point of that. If you don't have Christ's fish, which is the same paired fish as all the other fish, you don't get to become the Word of God. Christ's involvement has to be there, has to be incorporated in that process. Any questions on that? And so when it says in John chapter 1 that Christ would give them the power to become the sons of God, that's the point. That's the whole point of John. That's what John's about. John's about the development process of the sons of God, which is why in John chapter 1 we have this long, we have quite a bit of a story about Nathaniel, because what's the story of Jacob about? What does Jacob start out? Right? Guile, doesn't he? He starts out with guile. She's a trickster, right? He's a trickster. And what does he end up becoming? Humble. Becomes the prince with God. So what's the development process? The development process is we've got to get this out of him so he can become that. That's right. And it's a rough trot for Jacob, because he gets to the end of his life and he says, my life has been misery. Being dragged backwards through a hedge, a prickly hedge. Right? That's the process that he had to go through. And we have to go through the same process. We're going through a developmental process where we are trying to become the Word made flesh. We're trying to take on the character of Christ. And so that's the point of that story about the fish. Now, how do we know that to be true? Well, what's another validation point? Another validation point is, well, what's the conversation with Peter? What's Peter told to do? Told what? Feed the sheep, right? What does that mean? If you're there to feed the sheep, what's your job?
Look after your food.
Yeah, it is to continue the process of development, isn't it? So you need to continue on with the process of developing the Word of God in others. That was what he was being told to do. And Peter has a problem because Christ keeps using this word agape, right, which means self-sacrificing love that to give my life. And Peter's like, no, I'm not going to, I really like you, but I'm not interested in making sacrifices. Right? Like, he was honest. Yeah. I tried to chop somebody's head off, and then when I was tested on my faith, I failed 3 times, which is picked up at the end of John, isn't it? Because John says he denied Christ, and so Peter's honest, and so then Christ at the end of that says, "Well, okay, fine. Do you like me?" And he's like, now he's really depressed and frustrated. He says, I care about you. And he says, "Fine, feed the sheep." There's going to come a time when you will no longer be in control of your life. Somebody else is going to take control. And you'll be forced into a situation where you will sacrifice for them. You will give your life to them. Right? Somebody else will bind your hand. Somebody else will lead you away, signifying by what death you have died. And so Peter was still going through the development process. It didn't take very long. No, it didn't take Peter very long.
For about a couple of months, he was up there.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And you know what's interesting, because even here in this chapter, he's still worried about being who's going to be the greatest, right? Like all this Christ, still like, no man, like who cares? What is it to you whether he even lives forever? Like it's got nothing to do with you. And yet, when we get to the Jerusalem ecclesia, the Jerusalem ecclesia was the most important ecclesia in the world. And who runs the Jerusalem ecclesia? More importantly, who doesn't run the Jerusalem ecclesia? Peter. Because you would have thought Peter would be like, well, that's the most important job, and I'm the most important person, so therefore I must be doing the job, right? It's not Peter. Peter leaves that job to James, Christ's half brother. And then Peter goes to Babylon, of all places, and he teaches in Babylon. And we're going to look at Babylon today in the Exodus. Because what does Babylon represent? It represents the world. It represents that which destroys the ecclesia. That's actually what it represents. But we'll look at that in our Exodus a little bit later on today. And so Peter is told, isn't he, that he needs to go and feed the sheep. And that's the process. He's got to pick up and carry on from where Christ has really finished. Because in John 21, we're at the end of the process. So, bit of a convoluted expedition into creation from Proverbs, but the point of Proverbs really was the foundation work of the purpose of wisdom is creative. The purpose of wisdom is to create the sons of God. And so just as Solomon says in Proverbs chapter 3 that wisdom was with God at the very, very beginning, we find it's exactly how the book of John starts. Wisdom, the Logos, was with God at the very, very beginning. And that Logos was encapsulated in a man, and the purpose of the encapsulation of that wisdom in one man was that encapsulation should be in every man and woman, every son of God. And sons of God is not gender specific, it's a classification of people. Right? Just as it was used as a classification of people back in Genesis chapter 6. The sons of God saw the daughters of men. Right? So come back then to Proverbs chapter 3. And we, yeah.
154 fish.
Yeah.
7 fishermen plus Jesus makes 8.
Yeah, you're destroying my whole thesis.
I know.
So back to Proverbs chapter 20.
No, it's about the development of the disciples.
Okay, that's right.
That's why it's 7.
Yeah, what he said. Yeah. Like back of the class. Okay, so chapter 3, Proverbs verse 20. By his knowledge, the depths are broken up and the clouds drop down the dew. So this is interesting because where's my notes? Just get my notes back. Right. By knowledge, the depths are broken up. So where are the depths broken up? This is an interesting phrase. It doesn't occur previously. Yeah, so interesting. So the depths are broken up. This idea is a destructive idea, isn't it? So that's the results of a tsunami. That was the tsunami in Japan. A very, very destructive process. And so God's saying, I break up the depths of the oceans themselves. And we find that in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, if you just want to come back to that. Genesis chapter 7. And this is the record of the flood. Verse 11, he says there, now in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 7th day of the month, the same day, were all the foundations of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and rain was upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And so this is the destructive power of God being distributed. And so what Solomon's saying is, God knows when it's necessary to destroy. God knows when it's appropriate to enact judgment upon mankind. And that's the example that we find in Genesis chapter 7. It's also used in Exodus chapter 14, verse 16, in reference to the parting of the Red Sea for Israel to cross over. Right? It had the same idea of to cleave, to cut in half, and to bisect. And so he separates those two things. But then he goes on and he says, and the clouds drop down the dew. Oh, so if on the one hand you've got this destructive force, God knows when to use destructive force. What do you think this phrase is talking about? To drop down the dew.
Blessings.
Blessings, that's right. That's the opposite of destruction, isn't it? It's used in Genesis chapter 27, verse 28 to 39, of the promises made to the fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If you come across to Genesis chapter 27. Genesis 27 and verse 28. And this is in the context of the blessings on Jacob. Remember that Jacob deceived his father, and he gives a blessing to Jacob, thinking he's giving it to Esau. And so Jacob came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of raiment, and he blessed him, and he said, see, the smell of my son is the smell of the field, which Yahweh blesses. Therefore, God give thee of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of corn and wine. And so this is the extension of the blessings towards those who are the sons of God. It's also used in Exodus chapter 16, across Exodus 16, in the context of the manna. And so it says there in Exodus 16, verse 13, and it came to pass that at even the quails came down and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay round about the host, and when the dew had gone up, there was a small round thing, small as the hoarfrost on the ground. And so that was the manna that was left. And so what we're being told here is that God has a balance in his character between justice and judgment and destruction, right? So those who refuse to listen to God, despite his long-suffering care and continual appeal, if they refuse to listen, then God says, fine, if I can't work with you, then I'm not going to work with you. And he sends destruction. But his first instance, his first inclination is to send blessings, isn't it?
What was that quote in Exodus?
Exodus chapter 16,
Yeah.
verse 13. And so he sends out the dew, and the dew is a gentle thing, isn't it? Like you go outside in a howling thunderstorm, we had a bit of rain yesterday, right? It's hammering down, and what does it do? Well, it damages things, doesn't it? It creates too much water too fast, rips away the soil, damages plants. Well, we need it, obviously, because we need things to grow. But dew, you go out on a nice spring morning, and you see the mists over our farm, you can see the mist rolling across the hills with the wind, and it's just like a little blanket. It's just wandering along, gently watering all the plants, happy, and then it dissipates into nothingness as if it wasn't there. It's a very gentle process. And so God's character is balanced between mercy and grace and justice and vengeance. Now, that's important to understand because that is the basis upon which Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob understood God, because that is the father. Remember, Israel in Exodus chapter 6, right? They are told to understand God by the name Yahweh, right? Yahweh Elohim, the God of your fathers, right? But Yahweh Elohim is a national name. So throughout the Bible, God uses different names, and it's important to understand why he uses those different names, right? So Yahweh Sabaoth, Yahweh God of armies, right? That is a warning name. So when you read that in the prophets and it says Yahweh of armies, he's saying this: either you're against me or you're for me, right? But you choose a side. This is a sides thing, right? Yahweh Sabaoth, and then you've got Adonai Yahweh, which is the Lord, which is the sovereign God, right? So he's sitting in judgment, and then you've got Yahweh Elohim, which is the manifestation name or the national name. But there's another name called El Shaddai. And what does El Shaddai mean? Remember? We did look at it. Because that is the name that Jesus uses in the Lord's Prayer, isn't it? Our Father. It's a familial name. Keep it up.
Must mean mighty. Because Ale is mighty.
Yep. Power. Today on it. Right? And it's an unusual word in Hebrew. It's got two meanings. Shad means drink, which means to nourish a child. Right? But Shaddai means to destroy. It means to destroy and vengeance. And so this is the family, familial name God uses. Right? Right? And he says, this name is how Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knew me. They knew me this way. This is how I manifested myself to them. Because what was I to them? I was the one that nourished and sustained them and destroyed their enemies and protected them. Right? There's two sides of the Yahweh name, of that particular title. This is why it's important to understand the Hebrew, right, in these contexts. And so what does Christ say? Our Father. Is referring to that. Because we're not a nation now, are we? Israel as a nation is gone. So what are we now? What is our structure? Our structure is a family structure, isn't it? We have lots of families who come together as a family of God. And so what is our experience of God? This is our experience of God, El Shaddai. He nourishes us and he protects us and destroys our enemies. Now we may not see that. We might have people that we don't like and it causes grief and problems. But by and large, how much grief do we have? Not a lot. And I think when we get to the judgment seat, we're going to stand before the angel, and the angel's going to talk to us about the work they've been doing with us. The angel's going to go, well, there was that time when I got so-and-so to live with me. Like, what do you mean so-and-so? I thought it was a great one. Like, no. He had the knives out. You're just trying to free a brick. Or I got such to not pass that law, which would have persecuted you. Oh, really? I didn't know about that. See, there's a whole bunch of things going on in the angels in our lives who are hard at work, making sure that we're nourished and making sure that we're protected. And we're only going to find out about that when we get to judgment seat of Christ. Because we just bumble through life like 3-year-olds. Right? Walking along like we're in a park. All sorts of destruction and madness happening behind us. You know, we just perceive life as just a big open green field. Yet that's how God is manifesting himself towards us. And so it's by God's wisdom and understanding and knowledge of this creationary process. And what's the creationary process? The creationary process is that he might be manifest in his children. He's trying to create his word in us. Now, if we cooperate with that process, then this is going to be our relationship. But if we don't cooperate with that process, we're just like the Babylonians and the Esau's and the Judases of the world. Because it's an interesting point, isn't it? Actually, no, I'm going to cover that later on in the Exhort.
Blessings and cursings.
Yes. It's interesting because God gives them a bunch of blessings and a bunch of cursings. And he says, okay, so here's the deal. You get the blessings if you undertake the process. If you don't undertake the process, you get the cursings. By the way, those cursings are the same cursings that the world gets. It's not like God allocates a special list of particular cursings that he's allocated for those who refuse to be his children. That's actually tied up with what the world receives. Any questions in the last 2 minutes?
Interesting that the double meaning of Shaddai covers like male and female
Yes.
characters as well. God's got whole
Yes.
Even though he called him father.
Yes.
No.
Well, God talks about himself as being a nursing father. I was a nursing father to you. Right? It's because of the baby gives baby a bottle. But it's the same process. It's that familial.
Oh, which he divided between them.
Yes. Yeah. Right. God does it perfectly, whereas we need 2 people to fulfill that requirement. Okay.
Double meaning reminds me of, as in Mandarin, you've got the word Gongshi, which means strings. You know, it's like north, south, no, so east and west. Gongshi. So you've got 2 kind of opposites. There you've got 2 opposites.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not looking to further, just it's the same usage. I'm sure you can explain it.